The illusion that broke, how Europe and America quietly rewrote the endgame in Ukraine. There is a moment in every long war when reality intrudes, not with explosions or declarations, but with a change in tone. It arrives quietly, almost politely, embedded in diplomatic phrasing and budgetary footnotes. For Ukraine and its Western backers, that moment came in late 2025. Somewhere between Brussels, Washington, and several unnamed European capitals, a sentence began circulating in private conversations, never intended for press releases but impossible to ignore: Zelensky cannot be saved. This was not a moral verdict on Volodymyr Zelensky, nor a denial of Ukraine's suffering or courage. It was a recognition that the political ecosystem sustaining Ukraine's war effort, the vast edifice of Western unity, moral clarity, and strategic confidence erected in 2022, had begun to fracture under its own weight. The battlefield had frozen into attrition. Western cohesion had thinned. American priorities had shifted. European patience had eroded. The war continued, but the illusion that once powered it had cracked. Unlike Europe's great ruptures, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Yugoslav wars, the Eurozone crisis, this one came without drama. No crowds, no speeches, no flag-lowering ceremonies. Instead, there were non-decisions: Italy quietly withdrawing from a flagship support scheme, Czechia discovering technical malfunctions in its tanks, Finland hesitating over long-term security guarantees, Romania intercepting a Ukrainian drone it might once have ignored. None of these acts ended the war. Together, they signaled something more consequential: the end of certainty. Europe, officially, remains resolute. Unofficially, it is exhausted. What began as a moral test has become a budgetary one. Energy prices, though stabilized, remain structurally higher than before the war. Industrial champions, from chemicals to car makers, have relocated production to the United States, lured by cheaper energy and generous subsidies. Fiscal rules, loosened during crisis, are tightening again. Defense budgets balloon as social spending strains under inflation. European voters, asked repeatedly to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, have begun to ask what exactly it is. Polls across the continent tell the same story: support for military aid has dropped sharply since 2022. This is not Russophilia. It is fatigue. Democracies can absorb moral arguments for only so long before demanding arithmetic. Germany illustrates the problem most clearly. Its post-war economic model, cheap Russian gas feeding high-value exports, collapsed in 2022. What followed was not merely stagnation but strategic anxiety. Berlin still speaks like Ukraine's indispensable pillar; it now behaves like a government searching discreetly for an exit. France offers a different contrast. President Macron's rhetoric, hinting at troops, invoking European grandeur, has far outpaced French capacity. Paris wants influence without underwriting an open-ended war. It wishes to lead Europe in ideas, if not in ammunition. Eastern Europe, often portrayed as uniformly hawkish, has begun to recalibrate as well. Poland and the Baltic states understand a blunt truth: without America, their ability to sustain Ukraine collapses. Hungary and Slovakia no longer hide their dissent. Europe is not abandoning Ukraine out of cruelty. It is succumbing to political gravity. That gravity is strongest in Washington. For 2 years, American aid functioned as oxygen for Ukraine's war effort. In 2025, that oxygen has thinned. The reason is not sentimentality towards Moscow, but hierarchy. China remains America's central strategic adversary. A prolonged European land war diverts resources from the Indo-Pacific. Domestic politics punish foreign entanglements. A weary electorate questions why billions are spent abroad as bridges at home crumble. The much-vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive failed to deliver decisive results. Further investment now promises diminishing returns. The result is not betrayal but reprioritization. Ukraine has slipped from defining moral cause to problem requiring managed de-escalation. The signals to Kiev, though couched in diplomatic language, are unmistakable. Anti-corruption body supported by Washington increasingly target Zelensky's allies. Aid is conditioned ever more explicitly on reform and strategic alignment. American think tanks discuss post-Zelensky scenarios with growing openness. Rhetoric shifts from victory to responsible endgame. Zelensky is trapped in the classic paradox of wartime leaders dependent on foreign patrons. Negotiate and risk domestic backlash. Resist and lose Washington. Sovereignty becomes fragile when the interests of patrons diverge from those of the client. History offers few exceptions. Europe, meanwhile, has perfected the art of withdrawal without announcement. Italy exits by euphemism, citing budgetary priorities. Czechia retreats behind technical excuses. Finland, the newest NATO member and no naive about Russian power, refuses to assume long-term risks that even the United States will not formally guarantee. Romania enforces boundaries literally, intercepting drones and signaling that it will not be dragged into escalation to compensate for Ukraine's desperation. Each act, taken alone, appears minor. Together, they form a pattern of disengagement conducted without the inconvenience of public debate. Nothing exposes Europe's unease more starkly than the proposal to seize roughly €140 billion in frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine. The idea sounds seductively simple. It is, in fact, a legal and financial minefield. At its center sits Euroclear, the Brussels-based clearinghouse that processes over €1 trillion in transactions daily. Its credibility rests on a single, sacred principle: sovereign assets are inviolate. Break that principle once, and it is broken forever. Belgium, normally Europe's most reliable pragmatist, has become the plan's loudest critic. Not out of sympathy for Russia, but out of existential fear. As host to Euroclear, Belgium would face lawsuits, capital flight, and long-term reputational damage. "You do not blow up the house to heat one room," a Belgian official remarked privately, with admirable restraint. Yet Ursula von der Leyen continues to push the scheme. EU funds are running dry. She needs a symbolic victory. Washington quietly approves, content for Brussels to bear the legal fallout. The plan is less a funding mechanism than a precedent-setting detonation. Once sovereign assets are no longer safe, non-Western states will draw the obvious conclusion, and move their reserves accordingly. In Kiev, the psychological impact of the West's shifting mood is palpable. Ukraine's greatest fear is no longer Russian missiles but Western silence. The narrative that sustained the country, inevitable victory, unbreakable unity, Russian weakness, has lost coherence. Where there was once triumphalism, there is now anxiety. Ukrainian media increasingly accuse allies of betrayal. Conspiracy theories flourish, not because they persuade, but because the official story no longer convinces. Inside the Ukrainian state, three camps have emerged: negotiators who argue the war cannot be won outright, maximalists who insist any concession is treason, and survivalists who fear Washington is preparing a leadership change. The third group, ironically, appears the most realistic. On the battlefield, morale erodes slowly but steadily. Recruitment declines. Ammunition shortages persist. Desertion, though still limited, rises. Wars rarely collapse when armies surrender. They collapse when soldiers lose faith in the political strategy above them. As the fog lifts, an uncomfortable truth governs every closed-door discussion. Ukraine cannot win outright. Russia cannot lose outright. The West cannot fund the war indefinitely. Negotiation is inevitable. Until that truth becomes publicly speakable, the war will continue, not out of strategy, but inertia. Europe is not betraying Ukraine. It is betraying its own fantasies, the belief that moral clarity could substitute for strategy, that sanctions would break Russia, that history would bend cheaply and on schedule. America has not lost faith in Ukraine, it has rediscovered its priorities. Europe has not abandoned its values, it has exhausted its money, patience and political capital. Ukraine's tragedy lies less in Western treachery than in Western miscalculation. Its survival was tied to a narrative written in Washington and Brussels, a narrative that functioned only while costs were low and outcomes aligned with domestic politics. When those conditions vanished, so did the story. History is rarely shaped by betrayal. It is shaped by illusions that outlive their usefulness. Ukraine is not the victim of Western cynicism. It is the victim of a beautiful narrative that could not survive contact with reality.